Welcome everybody to another session from the RPA Vanguard channel. My name is Andy Menon. In this video, we are going to be continuing our discussion on how to filter data values from multi-select drop-down controls in UiPath apps. Let's get started. In the previous session, we started with the basic example of how to filter data values in multi-select drop-down controls in UiPath apps. At the end of that session, I had said that there will be some additional considerations that you have to take into account if you're building such kind of a functionality into your UiPath apps. As a result, I've added multiple examples here to take us through these considerations one by one. And at the end of this episode, I hope that you will have all the knowledge that's required for you to build a UiPath app that has this kind of a functionality as part of its application feature. So with that, let's recap briefly with the basic example that we covered in the previous episode. So on the left is a multi-select dropdown, and it has a predefined or fixed set of values that we can select. And then there is this other multi-select dropdown on the right that contains all the values that we have pulled from the data service. In this case, the data is visible by default, right? As the user logs into the app and then hits this page, all the data is visible. Now, if this data has to be reduced, or if you want to apply filters so that you can focus on certain subset of the data, you make some selections in the first dropdown and select one or more of the data points that you are interested to filter. So if I select two of them and exit the box, you will see that the number of items listed in this box change. This is an example of an interactive app, right? Basically, what you're doing is you are making some selections, and as you make those selections or as you unselect your choices, the application responds accordingly. And apart from the interactive way of building this app, we also have to just talk about what are the use cases for this kind of an app. This kind of an app will help in cases where the usage is much more open, meaning when the user reaches this page in an app, the data is visible by default. All data is visible by default. But there is so much data that you want to filter and focus on only those subsets of data that you might be interested to work with, right? For example, if you're shopping for laptops, if you perform a search on Amazon, you will have hundreds and even thousands of results. And you would want to apply filters to them based on the processor type, the manufacturer, the size of the disk, etc. Right? But what's going to happen if you do not want your users to see this data by default, right? What if you're building an app that is a bit more sensitive in nature, and then when the user makes it to this page, they are not permitted to see all of the data, right? And the only time they're allowed to see that data or view that data is if they make valid selections for a criteria. So this is an important consideration, because if you are having apps in an intranet or a corporate enterprise scenario, then the data needs to be regulated based on the privileges that a certain user has got. So let's look at an example that will demonstrate that. I'm going to be clicking on the second item below the active selection. There is this second item on this list. It is called Filter Multiple Column Values Advanced, and I'm going to click on it. So you can see that there is very little difference between the previous screen and this example. But observing carefully, you will see that some of the captions have been changed, right? And here it says that the application is still interactive in nature, right? But data is visible by selection only, right? Now, what does that mean? If I select this box, right, you see that there is no interactivity at all. This box has been completely disabled. And there is a label which is quite different here. It says no valid groups selected, right? So it's hinting to the user that, look, you are not going to be able to view the data in this box unless you have made some selections. So now I'm going to make some selections and let's see what happens. Now, as soon as I made a selection, you can see that the data is populated in this list, right? And this drop-down list on the right becomes active. If I go back to this criteria box and remove my selections, you can see that this box is disabled and there is no data that is going to be visible to the users. So this is another use case where you can still have interactivity with your application and you can still filter on data, except the data will be visible only if the user initiates an action to select certain criteria that they are allowed access to, right? So if you want to kind of expand this further, in the real world, most likely the groups that are going to be loaded in this box will change based on the user permissions. Let us say that the user is an administrator, in which case that administrator will have access to more number of groups in this box. And therefore, as the administrator makes those selections, more data will become visible in the right-hand drop-down box, right? But in contrast, if a non-administrator or a regular user has permissions to use this app, then the number of groups that will be visible in this box might be limited by the role that user has been assigned to. So you can see how we can use the methods of filtering data in multi-select drop-down boxes in cases where data is visible by default and where data is not visible by default. So let us now look into this page and see how the functionality has been created to disable this box and activate it on, activate it only when valid groups are selected from the box on the left. This page has been opened up in App Studio. As usual is the case, here we have the drop-down number 1. And again, this has a fixed set of values, just as we saw last time. And the selected value is associated with the app variable var multi-selected values. And if you go to the expression, again, the count is displayed based on how many selections have been made and assigned to var multi-selected values. We covered this in the previous video. So please do watch that because all of this has been explained in detail there. Coming to the right, this is where most of the change has happened. Here, there is the usual filter function, right? We filter on the drop-down list values entity, and we filter on the group name, and all the groups that need to be filtered on are in the variable var multi-selected values. So we covered this again in the previous video. Now, what happens here is the disabled functionality has been modified, right? We saw that when no selections are made in the box on the left, this box becomes inactive, right? We are not able to interact with it. Now that is done by a very simple rule applied or expression applied to the disabled attribute, right? So if I go back to Notepad, I'm going to simply write that condition. I'm going to say disabled equals count of var multi-selected values less than or equal to 0. What this means is when the user makes selections from the box on the left, then var multi-selected values gets populated with one or more values that reflect the selections of the user from this box on the left. In which case, the count of var of multi-selected values is not less than or equal to 0, right? So in which case, disabled becomes false because this condition is false. Now, if the user clears all the selections from this box and removes all of the selections, then the count of var of multi-selected values is less than or equal to 0, which is true, in which case disabled becomes true. And then this box becomes inactive, right? Very simple. Next comes the expression, right? And as you saw in this demo, when no selections are made, this message changes, right? Or it is a default message. It says no valid group selected. But if you did make some selections and X out, you can see that the message changes, right? So this requires a little bit of work. And if we go back and look at the expression, we have used the if condition in combination with the filter function to change this message based on whether or not the user has made selections to the groups on the left. So let's go into Notepad and write that condition out. Again, this filter condition was covered in the previous episode, so please do watch that video if you haven't already. But we are going to be using this in the if condition. Now we are going to first open our expression with the if function, open bracket, close bracket. I'm going to write it in multiple lines so that it's easy to follow, but otherwise it's all in one single line. And the first thing we are going to look to check for is the count of var multi-selected values. It's already here, so I'm going to copy it, right? And we are going to say, is it greater than 0? That means, has the user made any selections? If that is the case, then we'll have to write what happens if this condition is true. We write an expression saying total items in selected group, and then we take a count, open bracket, close bracket, and we take the entire filter function and put it in here. Now, if this condition is not true, then we have to write what happens if that condition is false, in which case we write the false condition and we say no valid groups selected, exclamation, close, and the expression ends right here. So you see, that is why you see this messaging change based on the selections made by the user in the dropdown on the left. The last functionality that is available on this on this interface to look at is the clear selections button. Obviously, we need to reset the form. So if I go to the clear selections, and if I go to events and edit the rule, I'm simply resetting the variable var multi-selected values. And because this variable is tied interactively, right, to all the other controls, that is the drop-down on the right, the expression on the right, because it is tied to all of them, the UI is reset immediately, right? So if I hit clear selections, the entire UI is restored back to default, and it's ready for the next input. So thus far, we have talked about two different options of building this UI. Both were the interactive method, but there is another method of having the same kind of functionality, but with a slight difference, right? So to demonstrate that, I am going to click on this item that says bad fix, passive filter, multiple values, right? Now, I will tell you why I call it a bad fix when we get to the demo. So in this UI, everything from the previous screen remains the same. You can see that there is this box on the left, there is this interactive box on the right, but it is disabled, right? So you still have the interactive method of working with this app, but I have added the third box named passive or deliberate filter result. This is also a multi-selected dropdown. And I wanted you to see the differences between the two methods of implementation. The first method at the top is the interactive method. The method at the bottom is the passive or deliberate method. Fundamentally, as I said, in the interactive mode, the application reacts immediately to your inputs. But in the passive method, you see that this control is not reflecting any change. See that? There is nothing happening here. You can do anything you want here. You see, there is no reaction from this control. So I'm going to make the selection display, and I'm going to exit. Obviously, this is correct. We got two selections. The box is still empty. And now I'm going to hit on passive filter on multiple criteria. You see, when I do that, this number changes, right? And now if I click on this box, I have the same results that you saw here. Therefore, the passive method of building an app is the user has to deliberately click a button or initiate an action, after which data is fetched, right? Now, as usual is the case, there is this clear selections button, and when I hit clear selections, everything gets reset. Everything in this box disappears. This box becomes disabled, and all selections are reset. But this is still a bad fix because this has still not been implemented completely and correctly, most importantly, right? But watch what happens when I click this button without making any selections here, right? I have not made any selections here, and I hit this button. All the data that the user is not supposed to see will be populated in this control. And that is why I call it a bad fix, because we have not covered all our bases when we implemented the passive method of fetching data, right, into the drop-down list. And we will try to remedy this situation in the next example. So in this section, we are going to look at the last of the examples. I have not demonstrated the design of this interface because we are going to be applying the fixes in the next example, and therefore whatever fixes you're going to see will be cumulative from what's already here, right? So with that, I'm going to now switch to the next example named fix passive filter multiple values. So here again, I have left the top part just for you to compare side by side how the application works. No change there. But the difference here is now both buttons are inactive. That means there is no scope for the user to click on this button to populate all the data that is available in data service without choosing or making valid selections of the groups. So now I'm going to select the groups. Excellent. So here we have got two values. This is almost as usual is the case, but watch what happened when I made the selection. The button is now active, right? That means only if there is a valid selection in this box does this button become active, right? If I remove the selections, the button goes away, right? It becomes inactive. So again, I'm going to now make my selection. No values here. I'm going to hit. And here you can see that the data has been populated correctly. Now, if I either remove my selections or hit clear selections, then this button goes inactive again. So I hit clear selection. Everything goes back to where it was, right? Therefore, you can see that when you are building something using the passive method of filtering data in your drop-down list, please do consider to cover all bases when it comes to allowing access to data. And something as simple as leaving a button active incorrectly can cause a lot of problems in a production application. The last thing that remains is for us to see, how this has been implemented. So I'm going to go back to App Studio, and I'm going to bring up the page named Fixed Passive Filter Multiple Values. When I click on it, so if we click on this box and look at its list source, it is an app variable. It is not a filter function, right? If you compare that with the green box above, this is more of an interactive live filter function that's bound to the data service, right? Here it is an app variable named DTListValues2. And the column is going to be list value, which is the column from the drop-down list values entity. Because when the data is fetched into this DTListValues2, it is going to have the same structure as your data service entity. And therefore, you can assign the list value column to the column attribute of this dropdown. That is the first major change. The second change is the expression here. Here, the count of the number of groups selected comes by running a count on the DTListValues2 app variable and is not the var multi-selected values variable that you saw earlier, right? That is applicable only to the interactive method of binding, right? But here, the count becomes available only after the user hits this button. That means the data must be populated in this DTListValues2, and then we must have a count on that variable, right? The next important change is the blue button itself. And if you look at the blue button and go into general, the first and most important criteria is the disabled attribute. Now, what I'm telling the disabled attribute is if the count of the variable named var multi-selected values 2 is less than or equal to 0, then disable this button. The var multi-selected values 2 is associated with this dropdown on the left. And if I take the group selection box, you can see that the selected value binding is set to var multi-selected values 2. And that is why when the user selects, makes valid selections from this box, this button activates. But when the user removes all the selections from this box, the button deactivates, right? That is how you make the association between this button and the selections in this box. The next important thing is what happens when the user clicks on the button. If I go into this button and go into events and hit edit rule, so when the user clicks on the button, the filter function is called. It uses the var multi-selected values list of selections that the user made in the groups dropdown. filters the entity, gets the results, and assigns it to dt list values to variable. And because this variable is associated with this box as data source, you see the results in this box after the user has clicked on this button. So you can see with very little work, a little bit of planning, you can build an effective fix or apply an effective fix on your app to prevent any kind of unwarranted data exposure. The other thing that we have to look at is the clear selections button. This is where everything on this form gets reset. Again, we have to look at the disabled attribute because you can use the clear selections button to reset the interface if the interface has been activated with some kind of selections, right? So what I have done is I've written an OR function and put a couple of conditions on it. So I'm going to write that here again. So I'm going to say disabled is equal to OR function, open brackets, close brackets. And the first thing I'm going to look for is whether this variable var multi-selected values is empty. Values 2 is empty, right? So I write this variable and then I apply the is blank function. I check whether it is blank, or I check if the count is less than or equal to 0. Count of less than or equal to 0. If any one of these conditions is true, then the button becomes disabled, right? Disabled turns true, and the clear button is deactivated. And that is why you see that when you come back to this interface, you hit clear selections or load this interface for the first time, the button is disabled. But if you make some selections, both these buttons are activated immediately, right? But if I hit clear, the button is inactive because there is really no need to clear any selections, right? Now, just like the blue button on the left, if we go into the event handler, clicked on and go into the edit rule, we have to reset everything that is associated with this UI, right? The first thing we do is var multi-selected values 2 is set to blank. And then we also set dt list values to blank. So when we do that, all bindings associated with all of these controls are reset, right? And the UI is brought back to its default state. The last thing, or the last implementation for this page is the loaded event of this whole page itself, right? So if I click anywhere in the blank area of this page and go into events, you will see that this is page 11. And if you go into the events, there is the loaded event. I hit edit rule. And this is similar to the reset functionality, except that the reset happens every time this page loads, right? So when this page is loaded up every time, all the variables, namely the var multi-selected values 2 and the dt list values 2 are reset. If I go back to the app and let me make some selections here and then hit this button, all data is available here. But let me go back to some other page and come back to this page. You can see that the page has been reset. Basically, whatever selections that the user made before switching out of this page were completely reset. That is where the onload event implementation comes into play. So that is all for this video, and I hope that you have learned something new. And I hope that I have been successful in demonstrating the different kinds of options that are available in UiPath apps in order to build a functionality where you will need to filter data in multi-select drop-down controls. And I hope that this gives you enough to implement these features in your own apps. And if you like the content of this video, please do like and subscribe to my channel. I'll truly appreciate it. Thank you, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.